Welcome to The Standard. From Vancouver, I'm Peter Klein. Tonight, a look at the changing face of journalism. Blogger Alex Tsakumis will be here to talk about how his popular website is often scooping mainstream news outlets for big stories. But first, an intimate conversation with the premier television news anchor in Canada, Peter Mansbridge. The winner of 12 Gemini Awards for excellence in broadcast journalism, Peter Mansbridge is chief correspondent for CBC's flagship newscast, The National. In this role, he's better suited than most to judge how the changing digital landscape is transforming how all of us consume news. He sat down with me for a conversation at the new Fairmont Pacific Rim Hotel in downtown Vancouver. Peter, thank you very much for joining us, for sitting down with us. And if you'd prefer to stand, would you feel more comfortable? What do you think about all the hoopla about you standing? I look back, I moved here recently from the US, but I would watch you on Newsnight, right, which we had in New York. And you used to do interviews standing 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah. No, I try to point to programs that I've done over time where I'm standing, and they're always the big historic programs, standing at the Berlin Wall with it coming down behind me, standing in Ottawa on, election nights or big leadership conventions or what have you. So, I mean, for us it wasn't anything new. Obviously, for some of the commentators, they had a little mileage out of it, but viewers didn't. I got very little mail from viewers.
Good or bad about it?
Just about the standing issue. It didn't seem to have an impact on them at all. Other things did have an impact on them, some of the moving graphics in the background.
Did people like that?
Well, the comments we got weren't, particularly flattering on some of the stuff on the moving background, and we've toned that down. Right. There's still a moving background, but there was too much going on, and it was distracting for some people.
Were people saying that it was more of an American sort of hyped sensibility in terms of the aesthetics?
There was some of that, not a lot of it. I mean, I've always kind of rejected that. I mean, they use that on the standing thing because Wolf Blitzer stands. Right. Well, I mean, the BBC's been standing for years on some of their programs, and as you noted, so have I. But it's like, well, if you're really going to take that theory, well, then did we all copy whoever was first in the sitting? Right. Nobody said there was anything wrong with that. So it's crazy. And, I do some of it standing, some of it sitting. I sit for the longer interviews and I sit for panel discussions and that kind of thing. But it's, over time, I think people got used to it.
But overall, you're happy with the makeover at CBC?
Yeah. No, I mean, the important stuff that we've done isn't the visual look of the program, it's the other things. I mean, I spend a lot of my day now doing a shortened version of The National for mobiles and handhelds. And there's been tremendous reaction to that, and that's what we were really trying to accomplish through this, is broaden the base of our audience. The people who watch the program online or in their handhelds don't watch it on television. They don't watch television anymore. Right. So, especially younger people, and we're trying to move into that market.
Well, it's interesting that this move was made, certainly stated to try to attract younger viewers. And frankly, I know quite a few younger viewers in their 20s and 30s who watch your show very regularly. That attempt was made in the US a couple of years ago when Katie Couric came, and I was there for that whole transformation. And I think a lot of people at the US networks have sort of given up on that and said, look, we do what we do well. We have our demographic of, skewing 55 and up. But frankly, that cohort of people is growing. The baby boomers who like the traditional guy sitting behind the desk and telling you the news is growing. So why don't we just put our money into that? And you look at NBC, NBC's ratings are growing.
They are growing, so are ours. I mean, we were up 30% last year over the year before. This year, as you know, they've changed the way these numbers are calculated, which initially didn't help us very much at all because it took our traditional demographic out of the mix in terms of the proportion it used to be in, which is older, more affluent, and better educated. Those are the ones that sort of peak for us, and that didn't help. We took a hit. Since we went through the changes on air, our numbers are up. I don't know what the actual figure is, but about 15 to 20%, somewhere in that range. So that's good. Look, I mean, at heart, people don't tune in to see whether I'm sitting or standing or the graphics are jumping up and down or not. They tune in for the news and the journalism.
The point, though, is that it's more than just the quality of the journalism, it's the habits. The New York Times does very good journalism, but young people don't go out and buy the New York Times, right?
Exactly.
It's the patterns of how they access that journalism that's changing.
If we sit still, we're convinced we're dead, generally. And the publisher of the New York Times doesn't think there'll be a copy that you'll hold in your hand in 10 years.
Right.
You know, he must know something. And so, you know, they're trying to adapt. And we're trying to adapt. It's, you know, the landscape of television news has changed considerably. And you know, Brian Williams at NBC is a friend of mine, and we got a lot of time for each other. But his numbers aren't anywhere near the numbers they had 10 years ago, and he knows that.
Sure.
They've had a good run lately, perhaps because of changes at the other networks, but nevertheless,
and the other
it's been
networks
good for them.
I mean, ABC just recently announced, David Weston, the president of ABC, announced a 25% cut in the news staff. CBS just laid off a whole bunch of my friends. I mean,
both of them were, and NBC, their move and their fascination now is with the digital.
Right.
And, you know, that's the same for us.
You were pretty outspoken about when commercials were first introduced. A lot of what we've just discussed the last few minutes, we probably would not have even discussed if there were no commercials right now at CBC, because what you would be looking at would be probably differently. You wouldn't necessarily mind if you had an older demographic if you had no commercials, but the guys who make the commercials don't like older demographic because older people are set in their buying habits. Have you come to terms with it? Is this something that you still rail out sometimes when you cut to commercial?
I'll never come to terms with the commercial issue. I mean, we're a public broadcaster. You know, surely there's some land that's sacred within our operation, and I would argue, obviously, that it's news. But because we have an audience in a primetime schedule at CBC, which on some nights doesn't have one, there's a revenue generation benefit for the corporation in putting commercials there for us. I don't like it. I've never liked it. I'm never going to like it. But I also recognize that, like all networks, we're in a money crunch. And they got to generate revenue somewhere, because we're not getting any more in terms of a parliamentary grant. It's been, for the most part, frozen and could be, you know, could come down. So they get their money where they can. Obviously, if I'd gone to CBS, as you know, you'd have made a lot more money. I'd have been living in New York at what was a pretty interesting time. But this was the job that I'd always coveted, you know, I'd always wanted.
Peter Klein's wardrobe for The Standard is provided by Samtani & Son Tailors in Langley. Men's and women's tailoring. Samtani & Son. Fitted for you, fitted right.
Welcome back. CBC News anchor Peter Mansbridge has covered some of the most important stories of our time, from election specials and Olympic Games to interviewing prime ministers and presidents. He has done and seen it all. Part 2 of my exclusive interview with him at the new Fairmont Pacific Rim Hotel begins with a discussion about the amount of stamina required to do what he does, day in and day out. You seem to have an incredible energy when it comes to certainly irregular broadcasts, but for long stretches. I had heard, tell me if this is true, that for an election night or covering a major event or a war, you actually get the sound techs to pipe in Rolling Stones and other music into your. Is that true?
Yeah, not during the program.
Right, but just to sort of
often
energize
before it on a big show, on a big special election night or something like that. It helps me get energized, could be the Rolling Stones, it could be Tragically Hip, or it could be a baseball game.
They don't force you to have Canadian content in there. No. But does this still excite you? I mean, you've been doing this for so long.
Yeah.
Every day you're excited to go to the studio?
Very much so, and I'll tell you why, because every day is different. when you're in this business, as you know, you're dealing with different issues every day. You're learning something every day. You're meeting people, often, at our level of, people who are pretty interesting to deal with. So I've never, it's 42 years for me now, and I can honestly say I've never had a day where I haven't learned something new, as a result of the job.
I mean, you really are a Canadian icon. You are, in so many people's minds, synonymous with Canadian news. But I know, just from reading your bio, that you and I were almost colleagues. You almost went to CBS at one point. We're considering it many years back, to going to the morning show, and were even talked about as potential successor to Dan Rather. Can you tell me why you didn't end up making that move? And if you ever think back, maybe I should have done that?
I've never thought I should have done it. I loved the people there, and I still have good friends there. And obviously, I made Harry Smith a wealthy man because he's still doing the morning show there. I was going. I was wooed by Howard Stringer, who was one of the great news leaders of our time, certainly through the 80s and 90s, and now he's off on other exploits at Sony. But he made it very attractive for me to go. And at that point in my career, I was prepared to go. I was the weekend anchor, and I was doing specials during the week and operating out of both Washington and London at stretches as filling in as a correspondent. But suddenly the top job at CBC came along when Knowlton Nash decided that he wanted to retire. And he didn't want me to go. And he'd been like a mentor for me for many years anyway. And so when it was the top job at the CBC versus the morning job at CBS, a lot of other things didn't enter the equation. Obviously, if I'd gone to CBS, as you know, I'd have made a lot more money. I'd been living in New York at what was a pretty interesting time. But this was the job that I'd always coveted, I'd always wanted. I'd started with the CBC at 20 years old in northern Manitoba at the most basic level. But even at that point, I dreamt of doing the National and anchoring it. And suddenly there it was in front of me, and I wasn't going to say no.
It's interesting. Of course, a lot of network producers are in town from the States right now. I'm friends with many of them, and they've been watching your show, and pretty much across the board, everyone's said wonderful things about it. But it's interesting. A few of them noted Peter Mansbridge is bald. Like he couldn't sit in Brian's chair or in Dan Rather's chair. That there's that just interesting little difference between the U.S. And I'll tell you. I mean, I've worked with a lot of the anchors in the States. I mean, we take hair and makeup people because they're bald too, but there's a lot of spray paint involved. What do you think about that? I mean, is that a difference in your mind in terms of the sensibility of the viewers here? That to me, it's a comment on a level of superficiality in the United States. But I'm curious if you think of that.
Well, I think it's we tend to make that argument that we're different because of something like that. Quite frankly, I don't think we are, and I'll tell you why. One, Harry Smith, the guy who ended up getting the job when I said no, was bald then, and he's obviously bald now. Right. So it didn't enter their minds for him, and it didn't enter Howard Stringer's mind for me, because I was already bald in 1988, and it, not like I am today, but it was showing. It was obvious that I had lost a lot of hair and was losing hair. But he never brought it up. Ever. And I was kind of surprised because I thought he would. Right. It never came up. It never came up in any of they did, as you know, they do a lot of work on focus grouping and researching stuff on new people. And it was just not an issue. And so I wonder whether it's as big a deal as some of us tend to think it may be. It's never been an issue for me at the CBC. They've never raised it with me. Nobody's ever suggested that I, wear a rug or paint the top of my head or any other things that you hear about. It just has never been there.
When I watch the National, it's incredible that pretty much every night there seems to be a major foreign story. I mean, you have, I don't know, I actually don't know how many foreign bureaus CBC has, but you must have.
We have a lot
lot
more than most American networks
well,
have
I was going to say, I mean,
they've cut back.
they basically don't have. CBS just closed down
we have
ABC.
closed some, but when we close one, we open somewhere else, and we're continually shifting around. We've made more presence in Africa. We obviously have a much greater presence in the Middle East as a result of the goings-on in the last 10 years.
Now, do you think your viewers want that, or is that just an internal ethical decision you've made?
Well, I think they do want it, sometimes even when they don't know they want it. And I'll use 9/11 as an example, because when 9/11 happened and we all understood, became clear quickly why it had happened and from where the threat was coming from, they wanted to know, well, why haven't you been telling us about this? Like, where are your reporters there? Well, in fact, we did have reporters there, and we have been doing stories on Al-Qaeda and on bin Laden. Sure. So we had been positioned, but we learned our lesson that we were doing the stories, but nobody was noticing them. So maybe we weren't giving them the kind of elevation within our program that they deserved. And that's one of the reasons why we've been adamant about trying to retain the number of foreign bureaus we have. We've had, we, like a lot of other places, are having to look seriously at where traditionally we've had foreign bureaus, because they just don't play the role they used to within the world story. And, Moscow,
I was about to bring up Moscow.
Paris, these are all decisions that are being made by all networks about whether to keep bureaus there.
But then the argument is that maybe you don't have a traditional bureau with a reporter and camera people and editors, but you have a one person, and some of certainly the US networks have moved towards that video journalism model where a reporter shoots and reports and does it all, and then could pop down to Ingushetia or to Chechnya or wherever from Moscow as necessary.
And we look at that and we do that in some cases, but it looks great on paper, and the accountants love it, but it's tough.
It's tough
for the person. Yeah. There's a lot of things to be focused on when you're covering a story, and that's why you have a team, because you need different people focused on different things. And so when you have the all-in-one, that's a heck of a burden to put on that person. It's funny, when we do research into the CBC, into our various different programs, the National and Hockey Night in Canada actually come out ahead of the CBC.
Welcome back. Whether it's reading the headlines on our phones or watching a newscast on our computer screens, technology is changing the way each of us consumes news. This is where CBC News anchor Peter Mansbridge and I start off the final segment of my exclusive interview with him. Where do you see television moving? Do you see, you guys have made obviously a lot of effort to go to mobile devices, as you mentioned. Is that where it's moving? I mean, is there going to be a traditional television in the living room in 10 years, and is there going to be an anchor either standing or sitting at a news desk at either supper time or 10 p.m.?
I wish I had the answer to that question. I mean, we've got to go on our gut. So much has changed in the last 15 years and 5 years, last 5 for sure. Trying to forecast what will happen in the next year or the next 5 years is tough, and it's a real gamble, and that's why you're seeing different networks going in different directions, because people are making different decisions. I remember when we started spreading our newscast out, not only in its traditional 10 p.m. slot on the main network, but every hour on our news channel. People laughed at us and said, "That's crazy. Why would you do that? You're just busting up your audience." Well, no, we were trying to offer it at different slots because people wanted it different times. Different people have, different schedules. And now that's our audience on our news channel, when you add it up over the different hours the national runs, is almost half of what it is on the main channel. That's not an insignificant number. So, I think you're continually looking for new platforms to offer up your program and your brand. we've got a great brand in the National. When when we've done research, it's funny, when we do research into the CBC, into our various different programs, the National and Hockey Night in Canada actually come out ahead of the CBC. And that tells you something. It told us that we got a great brand.
Right.
And we got to offer it up in as many different areas as we can. And that's why we're moving quickly into the online formats in as many different ways as we can. But your question's a great one. I mean, 5 years ago, nobody had flat screens hanging on their wall, or very few people did. Now everybody does. You go to a garbage dump in any city in this country, and you see brand new, what were traditional television sets a few years ago, sitting in the dump. Nobody wants them. So where will we be 5 years from now? Will we be looking at flat screens on the wall? Will we be getting our television, whether it's news or entertainment, in different forms?
Well, you have a son who's school-aged. Would you encourage him to be a journalist? Have you encouraged him to be a television journalist?
Well, I certainly, there's nothing wrong with the art of journalism or the profession. It's an honorable one that has a huge impact on all of us. And he's an inquisitive guy who's fascinated by asking questions, and if he wanted
the question is, will there be jobs? This is something that journalism students today struggle with. They go through all this effort to get a degree, and then realize that there are no jobs.
Well, I think there's always going to be jobs in journalism. It would be better if there were less, if there were more owners and less, situations where you have papers and television stations and radio stations all owned by the same person. Yeah. That's not doing any of us any good.
When you decided to go into journalism, your father was in the British Foreign Service. What did he say? Was he encouraging about it?
He was horrified.
He was horrified.
Yeah, he was in the Canadian Civil Service.
Oh, the Canadian.
We were born in Britain, and he had been in the British Civil Service, but when we moved to Canada, he was hired by the Canadian government. I mean, like a lot of people in positions of some authority, he'd had his problems with the media.
So you were joining the other side.
And it was a little bit like that. But it was good for me because he was continually keeping me in check. When I thought I'd had a good interview or a good story or a good program, I'd often hear from him on on how one could see it in a different light.
Yeah. Well, you spent a lot of time a good part of your childhood abroad. Has that helped you have more of a global view about the news?
I think so, but I think a lot of Canadians have a more worldly view of things, simply because of the nature of our country. We live next door to a superpower, obviously, and they have different concerns than we do. But we tend to look, I think, more outwardly. But as a journalist who's got to travel, has had that good fortune, it does give you a different view, not only of the world, but of your own country. But nothing, nothing is good as traveling your own country. And that's where I've been so lucky with the CBC, that's allowed me to not only myself travel, but allow us to take our program on the road, which we do. I mean, it's one of the great benefits of television and broadcasting today, is that you can move around fairly cheaply. In relative terms, certainly relative to the way it used to be.
Film cameras and canisters and everything else.
And you can broadcast from anywhere, live. I mean, I've stood on the deck of an icebreaker going through the Northwest Passage, broadcasting live. Obviously in Afghanistan and Iraq and, all kinds of places. Right. And it's a wonderful opportunity.
Well, I think a lot of Canadians know a little bit of your background, that you actually didn't go to university, that you really had this really pretty amazing trajectory into journalism, being discovered and show, with your hard work, working your way up. Do you ever speak to high schools? Do you go before high school audiences?
Oh yeah.
I mean, what do you what do you say to them? Stay in school, kids?
They don't like to hear my story because it doesn't make any sense to them, especially journalism students in colleges and universities, when they realize how I started. But it was a different era. It was the 60s. It was before Watergate and before the big boom into journalism, where everybody wanted to be, Robert Redford or Dustin Hoffman. What I tell them is pretty simple. You got to stay. You got to pack in as much knowledge as you can. But journalism at its core is pretty simple. This isn't brain surgery. It's being interested in what goes on around you, challenging assumptions, asking questions, and finding the form of media that you enjoy most in reflecting those answers to other people who are interested. I mean, that's it. Now, you learn all the expertise that surrounds that and use it to better tell the story. But, those things sound simple, but we've both seen people come into our business who don't have those core values. And they don't last long. They end up moving off into other things. A lot of people want to be journalists, but at heart they aren't journalists. And you got to have those. You're kind of born with some of those instincts, and then you layer on the expertise.
Right. We just have a minute left, but your plans? Any plans to retire? What does the future look like for you?
There will be a day when I will retire. Yeah, look,
you say that jokingly, but you look at the U.S. I mean, Mike Wallace had no plans of retiring, and he hasn't retired. He's 90 some odd years old. Dan Rather had no plans of retiring. He was forced out.
Yeah.
Peter Jennings, of course,
and he's
passed
still,
away.
and Dan's still chugging along.
Right.
With,
so I mean, it's a chair that's coveted, and people don't necessarily plan to retire.
No.
And you're still pretty young. So.
But there are others who have successfully, like Brokaw,
right,
who did it gracefully and elegantly, and with a network that allowed him to keep doing certain things.
Right.
And that's certainly an option for me. I'm not quite there yet, but that day will come.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Mr. Mansbridge has published a new book entitled Peter Mansbridge One-on-One. You can pick it up at bookstores everywhere. Special thank you to the new Fairmont Pacific Rim Hotel in downtown Vancouver for providing the venue. You've just seen the perspective of one of the most respected newsmen in Canada on how news media is changing. Coming up next, blogger Alex Tsakumis talks about the success of his website and whether bloggers are taking over the media world. That's next. Welcome back. One of the most popular blogs in British Columbia is run by a thoughtful commentator named Alex Tsakumis. Titled Rebel with a Clause, it can be visited online at alexgtsakumis.com. At the age of 23, he was a political aide for BC's Conservative Premier Bill Vander Zalm. And Tsakumis spends his time now digging up news about politics in Western Canada. Welcome.
Hi.
So Alex, what do you put on your tax return as your job? What do you know? There's a line there for occupation. Do you put blogger?
No, I put writer. I put businessman.
Is blogger ever in like one of those pull down menus these days? I mean, there are so many bloggers now. Is it being accepted as a profession?
It's more in vogue with bloggers than it is with others. I think it's emerging with more credibility, but I still think it's got a long way to go. There are blogs out there that are dangerously inaccurate and are just exist simply for the smear job. Many blogs, for example, that exist to discuss sensitive issues like the raid on the legislature a few years back, those are run most of them are run by people who have no other impetus other than no other drive other than to elect the NDP.
But what's wrong with that? I mean, the whole point of bloggers is that you're putting out a perspective, right? You're not going out there pretending you're some objective journalist. You're going out, I'm not saying you in particular, but in general, bloggers are often going
Although there are some people who would agree with you that I'm not objective.
Well, but a lot of people say, look, this is my agenda, and I'm maybe I'm an investigative journalist and I'm furthering that agenda. Maybe I'm just a political commentator. What's wrong with having an agenda online?
Again, it depends on the issue that you're covering. I think there are other folks that like to have an agenda and want to move forward like that. I don't.
Do you consider yourself a journalist?
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah. I didn't in the beginning. Mm-hmm. I fell into this job purely by accident.
Yeah, how did that happen?
I was actually one of the crew that helped elect Sam Sullivan mayor of Vancouver, and I was very proud of that. And Sam's a very decent fellow, but I soon became very disgruntled with some of the extreme policies that he was proffering, none of which that he'd raised when we were working to get him elected. And the Vancouver Sun asked me to do a special piece for them, and I did it. And then I got a whole pile of phone calls from a bunch of different newspapers and other news venues saying, "Hey, come on over." So it evolved.
Well, you've broken some significant stories recently. I want to talk about them, and also, if you know, not the you should. I don't want you to divulge sources, but maybe you can just tell us what your method is. Tony Parsons leaving Global, that was one of the stories that you broke. Why do you think you were able to break that as opposed to other mainstream journalists who cover? I mean, there are a lot of people who cover media for the Sun and other papers who missed it.
I am very blessed to have started out my career post-university in politics, and then in business, and then back to politics again, and then back to business, and then into writing. So
you know a lot of people.
Yeah. It was simply that. The Tony Parsons story actually was very interesting. I was having lunch with one of my lawyers downtown, and I hadn't seen him for a fair bit, and we were talking, and at the next table were some other friends who said, "Hey, how are you doing? How are things going? How are your kids, your wife?" Just, sort of the usual chit chat. And one of them pulled me aside and said, "Hey, I guess you've heard about Tony." And I said, I heard that he was going, but he said, he says he's leaving next week. And so I picked up the phone and I called Tony, and I've known Tony for years. He's a good friend. He spoke at my wedding, and I picked up the phone and I talked to him ever so briefly. I'd already had the story, but I needed some confirmation, and he confirmed it, and I wrote it.
But does that put you in an awkward position socially? I mean, I know someone who works for 60 Minutes, the joke is always, be careful what you say around him. But, you as you say, you kind of do go into a lot of different, you exist in a lot of different worlds. When you're around your businessmen friends, are they kind of worried, "Oh man, don't say this in front of Alex, he might blog about it"?
I think some people do, but other people, the ones that know me the best, know that I would never sell out a friend. I mean, if Tony had said to me, "Don't write the story," I wouldn't have written it. I didn't need to write that particular story. I just broken even bigger news, I think.
Well, let's talk about that. That was the chief electrical inspector story?
No, that was well after that. I'm talking about the Carol Taylor possibly coming back to run and rule the Liberal Party post departure of the current premier. That was a good story, and I chased that down for 3-4 weeks, and then spoke to somebody who had spoken to some cabinet ministers and had been party to a discussion with some organizers that were pushing Carol to do it, and that was a great story. I enjoyed doing that one. But then there was the Parsons story, and then the electrical inspector.
Well, let's talk about the electrical, because that's one that I think is one of those rare stories that I've seen that mainstream news organizations have rightly credited a blogger for breaking it. I've seen your name many times in regular newspapers or TV stories about it. Can you give us the kind of thumbnail sketch of that story, what you found out and how you found out?
Sure. After having spent 25 years in political backrooms, and I have made, as I mentioned earlier, some significant friendships and acquaintances, and I received an email from someone who works at the city and said, you might want to look at this. I enjoyed reading your stuff when you were a columnist at 24 Hours, and you did pieces for The Sun and for others, and I thought that you might want to see what's happening. We're under siege.
The idea was that this inspector was being critical of safety issues.
He had identified a particular product, namely a fire alarm panel at the Olympic Village, that he was concerned would malfunction under certain circumstances. And beyond that, there were others in his branch who had also mentioned that there were other safety issues related to Olympic venues, which have now been revealed actually last week in a major piece in the Vancouver Courier. they were revealed to be true. Up until now, the mayor's been saying that they were baseless. But the guy that he replaced the former city electrician with has now admitted that what I've been saying for the last month and a half, almost 2 months, is absolutely true.
Right. Well, let's take a quick break for commercial, but when we come back, we'll talk about some of your other political interests and potential aspirations. More with Alex Tsakumis in a moment. I'm back with blogger Alex Tsakumis. His website is alexgtsakumis.com. As you mentioned, you have political experience, business experience, and journalism experience. Let's talk politics for a minute. You started out with Bill Vander Zalm, the BC Premier, at age 23, which is pretty amazing. And you've kept your hand in politics. A lot of people who do that have interest at some point in running. Is that...
No.
Can you imagine yourself as mayor or as premier?
No.
Or as prime minister?
No, only maybe in my worst nightmares.
Why? You've seen it too?
I've seen politics from the nasty side so many times. It's not what it was even 4 or 5 years ago. It just gets progressively more nasty, and I'm jaded. I report on them, politicians. I report on some of their gaffes and missteps. I report on some of their successes. But politics has become a very, very nasty business. And I just, I find that the older I get, the more my relationship with my children, I have 3 children, just defines me. And I love them way too much to do that to them and spend so much time away from them. And, my wife is my best friend, and she'd be pretty disappointed if I went off and did something like that. But I guess, no one can ever say never. Maybe, someday I might completely lose whatever mind I've got left
but you are quite critical.
But I doubt it.
You are quite critical of the entire landscape. I mean, you lean conservative, as you said, but you seem to be critical of Harper and Ignatieff on the federal level, likewise on the provincial level.
Well, if I wasn't, I'd have no integrity.
Yeah.
If I was just going to sit
I mean, you could be a staunch conservative and say, I don't like how the Liberals are doing it. This is how we should be doing it.
Yeah.
But you seem to think that I get the impression from your blogs that you feel it's sort of all gone awry. Things are not.
It has. I mean, we're the country politically anyway. We're divided. We're disorganized, and in many ways defeated. I mean, a lot of the things and issues that matter to Canadians most don't often get addressed by any party. Just to go back to what I'd said earlier, I would be remiss if I didn't say that I respect both conservative bloggers and liberal bloggers, and even those who are NDP bloggers. I would not serve myself well if I didn't spread around the critique, because I don't. I mean, I admit that I'm a centered to right-leaning fellow, but lots of times that doesn't necessarily bleed into the fabric of my writing. Right. I support gay rights. I support a woman's right to choose, even though it's a very conflicting, abortion is a very conflicting issue, as we saw in the last few days in the United States. So there are lots of positions that I take that are very offside of the conservative take.
Well, as a sort of center-right commentator, what do you think of Michael Ignatieff? Has he been able to galvanize any real support within the party and within the country?
If Michael Ignatieff was a successful leader with all the missteps and all the mistakes that the Conservatives have made, if you just took the prorogation Donnybrook and added Jason Kenney removing any reference to homosexuals from the immigrant handbook, Helena Gurgis dumping on the province of Prince Edward Island, and Jean-Pierre Blackburn trying to get a bottle of tequila passed through the airport. Right. If you just you just assembled those alone. Michael Ignatieff should be ahead by 6-7 points on that alone, and he's still trailing by 3. So that tells you something about Michael Ignatieff. He has no real support in terms of any kind of organization in Quebec. In Ontario, they keep putting Bob Ray out there, who pretty much destroyed the province not too long ago. He's got some good folks in British Columbia. There's no question about that, but he's not doing very well.
And Harper, how do you think? Like you mentioned that, for instance, the airport. There were 2 airport incidents with ministers having sort of brouhahas in the airport.
Yeah.
I mean, just taking that as an example, the most recent one. Do you think that's been handled in a professional way by the party and by the Prime Minister?
No, I would have fired Helena Gurgis. I think her comments about Prince Edward Island were disgusting. And I would have kept Jean-Pierre Blackburn, but I would have pulled him into Langevin Block and said, look, if this happens again, you're gone. His infraction was significantly less
He's trying to get tequila
problematic.
Onto an
Yeah,
airplane.
I mean, he had something that he brought back. It's not a big issue.
Do you think it was an example of arrogance within politics, though? I mean, that's what people have been pointing at, that politicians feel like they have special treatment, and we, the people, don't like that.
Hard to say. In Gurgis's case, and I've only met her once, probably. In Blackburn's case, and I've met him a few times, I don't think so. I think he was just probably tired and upset, and this was a souvenir that he was bringing back. The only big sensationalist part of that story is that he was bringing over a bottle of booze. Right?
Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
You can visit Alex Tsakumis' website at alexgtsakumis.com. More of The Standard in a moment. Welcome back. So what do you think? How is the changing delivery of news reshaping your life? If you have a comment about tonight's interviews or an idea for a future show, drop us a line. Here's how. That's all the time we have for tonight's show. For everyone at The Standard, I'm Peter Klein. Thanks for watching.